Okay, so today is just question and answers and discussions, okay, about, well, about actually anything, but focused on what we have seen this week. So I'm open to questions. First question. Oh, okay.
You showed us that model where we had like different points of stability and even up and down a lot of times.
Yesterday?
2 days ago.
Ah, okay. The differential equation model with a complicated function. Okay.
Could you show us a more biological application of the model? Because I quite didn't understand like how we would have those jumps in population, where we would have like a population getting a very larger size, much larger size, and if they lost like a few more individuals, they would drop the population size a lot.
The main biological example was the Ailey effect, okay, which is the classical thing. Where's my? When we had, so we have an equation which is like this. There can be any function of n here, okay, and therefore, while I draw something like this, n dn dt, and here you can have in principle any function, okay, and now the classical example is Ailey effect, which is a third order polynomial, which is just a modification, okay, so Ailey effect, which is an equation which reads like this. Okay, so this, if you look here, you have a third order polynomial, okay? So third order polynomials, I mean, you can go and plot this, and what you will get is something like this, okay? And so here you have an up and down, okay? So we discussed that here you have this point is stable. So if you are here, you will never get here, because this point is unstable. So you get always back to 0. And then in this case, you can go here, and you go to what would be the carrying capacity. So now you were asking about jumps. So this is the model where you have a population size here, which is actually the C, which has this is threshold for the viability of the population. So a small population is not viable, so it goes to 0. Okay? Now, there are other models that have the same kind of effect that have multiple stable points. Okay. We will see one, but this is not a one single species dynamics. It's a two species dynamics, which is vegetation cover model. Okay, so this will come after. That will be an example of applications of population dynamics to understand desertification. This is more to the end of the course. Okay, but in this case, you also have two stable fixed points. You have here 2 points that are stable. This one and this one, which is equal to k. Okay, 2 stable fixed points and 1 unstable fixed point. Okay, so then what happens is, for instance, in the case of desertification, okay, you have the stable fixed point, which is 0 cover. Okay, you can modify this to have, instead of 0, a small vegetation coverage in our region. The most simple model is that the 0 is a fixed point, and then the full coverage at a certain kind of carrying capacity for the region is another fixed point, which is stable. Okay? So sometimes it happens that you have a region which is, say, has some vegetation cover, but something happens that it takes the system to jump an unstable fixed point. Okay, how it? Well, this could be many things. One is that you have a long period of drought, I mean, century-like. Okay, so having perturbations. So this, as I showed you here, I'm considering without perturbations, but you could have perturbations. Okay, so when you have perturbations, depends on the strength of the perturbation. You could be, for instance, here. You start here, and you are progressing towards the carrying capacity, but something happens. Something like a disaster, something which could be thought as a random perturbation, but not an infinitesimal. It's not a small perturbation, it's a big perturbation. And then this can make you jump here. Okay? Say it was a very strong winter and the population get almost decimated. And there is a population that is remaining, but now it's below the threshold, so it will go extinct. Okay, so you can jump from one to the other through perturbations. In the same case, in the case of stability, where you have fixed points, which are the limits, carrying capacity, or zero coverage by vegetation, and well, there is an unstable fixed point in the middle. Okay? So in principle, you cannot jump. But you could think of jumping somehow, for instance, by irrigation. You could artificially go, in this case it's not the whole desert, I mean it's a small region. Okay? But you could artificially put the system out of the region that out of what we call basin of attraction, by irrigating and forcing the vegetation cover to be high enough. Then you go to this, you jump here, and here you are. Okay? So this is the case, what people call systems that have alternative stable states. This is the jargon in ecology and in environmental sciences, which in mathematical and physical language is that the system has two stable fixed points, so it's called bistable. Okay, so these are situations that happen. This kind of going from one to the other fixed point happen in many systems. So you have also the situation where you have, for instance, lakes. And the lakes, they have vegetation. Now, maybe you have pollution, which can be sometimes seen as nutrients for the vegetation. So there is a phenomenon that's called lake eutrophication. Lake eutrophication is when you have too much nutrients coming usually due to pollution, and from one day to the other there's a transition between a nice lake with transparency and so on to something which is just completely covered by like a green color. Okay, so this is also a transition. The transition in this case, and both the clear lake and the green or brown lake, both of them correspond to stable fixed points of the system. And you can jump from one to the other by perturbations. So you perturb in such a way so much pollution that you drive the system from the stable state that you wanted to a stable state that you don't want. Right? So that's classical example of alternative stable states. Okay? So and usually this is not as simple as something like this, because this is a single species case. Right? Now, so these models are more usually more complicated. But what is relevant sometimes is to look at this as this kind of equations, or maybe a set of equations a little bit more complicated than that, and consider these equations under the presence of perturbations, random perturbations, which in the physicists would call it noise. Okay, so now these things are not anymore just functions; they are random numbers, and then you have something like this. You add something, which is noise. So this becomes a stochastic dynamics now. Okay, so you can simulate this. I'm not writing exactly how it is, because you have to know something called stochastic differential equations, so it's not part of the course, but you can see that you have a deterministic dynamics, but on top of the deterministic dynamics, you say, okay, this my system is described essentially by my deterministic dynamics, but it's under noise. So you can model this. Okay? So there is an example which is not biological, but it's a nice example, okay? Which is, consider a system where you have a small ball which is in a kind of well, a double well. You have 2 points here, okay, double well. Okay. Now you have the small balls, and under the effect of gravity, what will happen is, where are the two stable fixed points in this case? Those, okay? If I put the ball here, it stays here. And I put the ball here, it also stays here, okay? And if I have an unstable fixed point, which would be I put the ball here, it would stay here, but in unstable it will go to one or the other stable fixed points. And we are considering that there's very small friction in order to get the balls to the fixed points. So now this is nice. Now say you start to kick this. Okay, so you are gonna kick the ball. Okay, and you have a distribution of the strengths of your kicks. Okay, so most of them are not very strong. They are just small kicks. But there's the distribution, and maybe sometimes you have a rare event where you have a non-zero probability of having a very strong kick. Okay, so in this case, say you are starting here, okay, and you start to kick it a little bit, and then you want at a certain pace of intervals, after certain time intervals, you record where you find the ball. Okay, so after some time you will get, if I'm doing this with a normal distribution of kicks, for instance, or something, now you will have a distribution of the positions like maybe something which is not necessarily a Gaussian, but something that is like this. Okay? Most of the time you stay here. Sometimes you have a little bit stronger thing, and here, and then you get this is the distribution of the positions of the ball. Okay? Now, say that there are some strong kicks, but now maybe this describes some system, and there's a change in the system which actually makes the following. It lowers this threshold. Okay? It's a lower point here. And in this case, well, it's not well, my ability to draw is not so good. So it becomes easier to go from one to the other. Okay? So if you wait enough time, as you have a non-zero probability of having strong kicks, then you will, at a certain point, transition from here to here. And then continue to kick. And then you will stay here. So it's a fixed point. Okay, so your distribution, if you wait enough time, is not with one peak, it has two peaks. Okay, so this is the case. So this is it's a toy model for transitions, and many systems can show this kind of transitions. I have an example, which is a work that I did. Paulo and Renato, we published a paper. You know, in 2014 and 15, there was a very strong drop in the state of São Paulo. And the water reservoirs, a specific water reservoir, the biggest one near the city, was at a very, very low levels because of the drop. Well, then it starts to rain again. But the level of the reservoir reacted very, very slowly. It didn't go back immediately. So it took a very long time, actually, to refill the reservoir. So what our model showed, and we also, I mean, this comes together with some data analysis about the fluxes of which enter or not the reservoir. Showed actually that there were two stable fixed points. One is the normal regime, and the other one is the regime of non-normal regime because you have properties of the soil that when it gets dry, that cannot absorb. You have immediately make the rain and the water coming from the rain run. First, it will be absorbing until it's saturated. Therefore, there are two stable fixed points. One is when you get the normal situation, the one where you have a very low amount of water in the reservoir. Okay, it's a little bit more complicated because actually, if it rains a lot, then you can get back again to the normal reservoir. Okay, so, but this is also a situation where you have two fixed points, and you have a transition induced by external factors on the system. There's a lot of there's even books on alternative stable states that's connected to the idea of resilience of a system, and people were pretty much interested in for instance, vegetation cover is also a kind of this kind of transition or eutrophication. So how could you monitor your system and know if you are very close to have a transition or not? Okay? Because mathematically the transition is almost instantaneous, but obviously it takes a time to go to the transition. So this is called how it's called, man? This is early warning signals of critical transitions. So there are, if you write down this on Google, we'll get papers and books about this kind of thing.
Well, in the ecosystem, there are studies.
No, this one is the bad one.
There are studies about ecosystem dynamics that discuss the tipping points of an ecosystem changing to another.
Yeah.
Like
So
the same example.
that's an example. So when you see a lot of people talking nowadays about tipping points in climate dynamics, okay? So and there's this people that talk about the hot Earth and so on. So tipping points are this kind of thing. It's a situation where your system may transition between different stable states, and which means that it loses resilience. And what it is this? When I'm here, say, and I'm kicking, I am always tendency to go back to the stable state. Okay. Okay. So you say there's some resilience in this system. Okay. Because under perturbations go back to what is the stable state. And now, sometimes when you have this kind of transition, or if you have very low barrier here, because sometimes maybe this is connected to some external factor, maybe this actually can fluctuate or something like that, then you can lose resilience and say, okay, it's not it's losing resilience in the sense that it's going to another fixed point, which is the fixed point that maybe you don't want. So, okay, more questions. Here and then you. One. And you.
Could you talk a little more about minimum viable population and
About
its
what?
minimum viable population, and that's something we're seeing on the project, but its relationship with minimum patch size?
Oh, okay. It's not the same thing.
No, I know. But
Okay.
like,
Okay.
are they related somehow?
No. So, okay. So minimum population size is what we discussed. I don't think we have to discuss again all the story about ALE effect. It's the fact that small populations are not viable because what? Because maybe they have a group behavior, and you need a sufficiently large group, or other kinds of things that can happen with small populations. They are prone to extinction due to random effects, or so on. The minimum patch size is a subject connected to spatial ecology. Okay? So we are not talking here about the spatial aspect of our population. So we are just saying the population is the number of individuals. But now, if you want to take into account space, then you will have to modify a little bit the framework. So if you're now interested how, not only on the total population size in a certain place, but also how the population distributes itself on this domain, then in this case, say, you will have to use a concept of not of the total population size, but the density of the population. Okay, how many individuals per square meter or square kilometer per area? Okay, individuals per area. And then, in order to build a theory, you will have the normal part, which is the population dynamics, which is maybe, say it's just logistic or whatever. But then you also have to say how population behaves in space, how they distribute in the space. So this is different from saying what individuals do, the movement of the individuals and so on. The study of this is not spatial ecology, it's movement ecology. Okay? At the level of population, you will say the population tends to this, in ecology sometimes we say tends to disperse, but the technical term is diffusion, right? So it stands, and diffusion, what does diffusion? Say I have here my space variable, let's say the space I'm drawing only one-dimensional space, but, okay? And here I have some density, which is usually used rho, number of individuals per unit area. And then, if you start with a distribution of in space like this, population is concentrated at a certain point, over time, then this will go down, but will be broader here. And then it goes on diffusing. So this is diffusion, okay? So in spatial dynamics, you have, in the simple case, it's diffusion. There are many kinds of diffusions, actually, but okay, the simple diffusion is called Gaussian diffusion. And you have diffusion, and you have the dynamics of the population, of the birth and death processes. And so let's say the population has now, now let's say the population is not, is on a finite domain. Your system has a certain size, okay? So say it would be X, okay? And outside here, individuals die. It's not, they are, usually this is called the habitat, and outside it's a matrix. Okay? And then you have the following. Say you have logistic growth. So logistic growth has the tendency to increase the population up to the carrying capacity, but diffusion tends to spread it out. So there's competition. To know what level of population you will have, there's a competition between spreading, diffusing, and increasing. So they compete both. And one result of this theory is that if this is too small, diffusion is more important than growth. Therefore, what will happen is that you lose all your individuals by the borders, and the growth is cannot oppose this, and then you go to zero. Well, this is a result. I'm not explaining exactly why, but it's a process of going out here and trying to increase here, and the equilibrium depends on the size. And a certain below a certain size, the population will go extinct, and this is what's called the minimum patch size. É a mesma coisa? Ah, na continuação, sim, claro.
No, so now I was wondering, because those are different things, but I was thinking, for instance, of the Amazon forest and like how like there's a minimum viable population of trees because of the, but that's what I don't think I fully understood the concept of minimum viable
So
population.
I'm not saying that
maybe?
this is important for every kind of species.
No, okay.
Yeah.
But I was thinking of trees and how we can't, like, we have a threshold of how much forest we can leave before it just crumbles on itself, right? Because of the processes of the forest. Would that be considered minimum viable population? Would that be considered a group behavior that, like, the species have? I don't.
Well, for the specific case, I don't know. I have never seen ALE effects with vegetation, okay? But maybe I just didn't pay attention. I mean, I don't usually, the examples that come to mind, it's with animals. I don't know, with trees, if you have the problem of having minimal viable populations. I don't know, because there should be any cooperative effect in order to happen. And it's not clear in this case if there are cooperative effect, in a sense, maybe indirect cooperative effect between the trees. But I have never heard about minimum viable populations for this kind of thing.
Because there's like an interaction between the trees and the rain and then the soil,
Yeah.
and it all feeds one another. And I guess I'm wondering if that could be considered a kind of group behavior, or I don't know.
No, this is not a group behavior. These are feedbacks. Okay, these are feedbacks. So this is more close to what we discussed before about the critical points. Okay, so there could be something like at a large scale. So how just okay, how is the okay? So how is the climate dynamics, the circulation of water connected to the Amazonian forest, okay? So this is something relevant, because, for instance, here in São Paulo, when you say, when it rains, you see it always almost coming the fronts from the south. There comes the cold front from the south, and then it clashes with the hot, and then it rains and so on, and you can see but in Amazon, this is more complicated, because here it's not the water that evaporated here that rains here, okay? Now in the Amazon, there's so much water and connected to the Amazonian forest that the evapotranspiration of plants is very important. So it is actually a part of the rain is what people call convective rain. It's from there, goes up and down, so it's called convection technically. So this is not the only one, because you have also the currents of air coming from the region of, would be near, coming into Brazil near Ceará, then going up to the Andes, and then bouncing back, and then all of this gets confluent in the Amazonian region. Now, one point is, if you just get chopping the trees or burning down things, then the effect of the convective rain will diminish. And well, there's a hypothesized tipping point at that. And this hypothesized critical point would be that if the convective rain, the convection, is too small, then the rain there's a feedback, because this will say you have less rain. Having less rain, you will have less forest, and having less forest will have even less rain, and so on. So this keeps going on, and this would say that at the end you could go to a savanna. Okay, so this is the considered tipping point related to the Amazonian forest. So this, what you ask me, is a situation between tipping points. It is not the minimum. I mean, you have to have a minimum evaporation, That's true. So you have to have a certain number of trees, but it's not connected to the intrinsic dynamics of trees. It is connected to the ecosystem and to the climate system. Okay? So it's a little bit more complicated. It's a tipping point in this case. So you wanted to complement this, or because there was a question there, but in the same subject, yeah?
Especially regarding tropical rainforests, there's something to consider that is border effects. So there are many species of trees that can't live on the border of the forest, and they need like a buffer to exist. So if you cut down squares, perhaps there could be desertification or something like that, depending on the patch size, because of those trees that can't live on the border. So border effects is something that maybe you could look into.
Yeah, that's true. There are border effects. Yeah, because usually the border that degraded. It's not a sharp border usually. It's not that you have a super forest here and then you don't have anything, except if it's artificial, which is actually a project that exists for years and years near Manaus, which is called the Projeto de Dinâmica Biológica em Fragmentos, or something like that, okay? And this is very interesting. They do already, I think, 30 or 40 years ago, do census of species, and they have a lot of patches of different sizes, and then they want to know how the size of the patch is affecting the species. For instance, maybe there are patches where it's small, certain species you don't find them, and then larger, maybe you find them. For instance, this happens with birds and so on. There are papers on that actually, and also then, well, they also study the regrowth in the matrix and so on. So, okay, so there was a further question here. Yeah.
My question is more about the subject from 2 days ago, kind. We were discussing about models, a single species model. At the end of the class, you said that many species could behave as a single species and the model could be applied. I wanted you to talk more about that because it was too fast and I didn't understand very well.
Okay, so let me erase this first. So, one way of having a single species dynamics would be have an isolated species, which was usually the case only in the labs, okay? So, this is the trivial case. Now, let's think about trophic levels. So for people that do not come from biological science, trophic networks, you have a species and you have the consumption of one species by the other. Could be predation or parasitism or whatever, okay? And so let's say you have 3 trophic levels, okay? And you have a lot of species here at the basic, and some intermediate. So usually you use this kind of symbol to say this one is being consumed by this one. And then a further case where I have this third one and say that this species is consumed by many of them. Okay? So, this is an opposition. Well, then you can also have some others here, but simplified. But now, this is opposite to the situation where you have one species which consumes the other. Okay? Say species A and B. B is being predated. For instance, B is a prey and A is a predator. Why is this different? This cannot be described by a single population dynamics because they are intrinsically bound with one another. So typically, if you have the prey in large numbers, the number of predators will increase because there's a lot of food for them, which will deplete the number of prey. And then on the long run, this can also make the population of predators decrease because there are no preys enough. And decrease in the population of predators will increase again the number of prey because the predatory pressure is not very strong, and so on. So you cannot separate both of them. Okay? They are intrinsically connected.
So let me see if I understand. For instance, when we talk about the Ali effect, this critical point for a population size, for instance, the critical population size for population B, could very well, this effect could be caused by depredation by population A.
Could. Okay, so that's an interesting point. When one of the species exhibit Ali effect, you can have, say the population of prey has Ali effect. Means that if it goes below a certain threshold, it goes extinct. Okay? So now say that your system can be modeled by this relation. That's the main relation between those species. The rest of the relations to other species is not very important. Okay? So, for instance, A can be a specialist. A specialist predator is a predator that needs a certain species. Okay? Feeds only on that species. Or even it's not a specialist, maybe species B is necessary for the existence of A, even if it preys also on others, because it cannot live only on the others. So it's so several situations where actually this is the main factor driving these populations. Okay? Now, if B has a minimum population size, and if the predator's pressure is strong, say the predators are super good in predating, well, then you start with a big population here, and a small population of predators, but the predators are good, they predate a lot, so the population of prey gets smaller and smaller, and the population of predators gets bigger and bigger. But if there's a minimum population size, then maybe this population size is attained, the threshold is attained, and the predators continue to predate, and then the population of prey goes to 0, and then the population of predators will also go to 0 because it's an essential nutrient for them. So that's a situation, for instance, when you have the minimum population size, in the Ali effect in general may drive extinctions of other species that don't have a Ali effect. Say A doesn't need a Ali effect, but actually it's an essential nutrient. It's an essential resource to prey. So if there's no prey, then it goes extinct. And so this is the situation where you have a population, both of them going to 0. Right? So just to finish this discussion, here it's exactly the contrary. Okay. So is it the same subject? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, here. Take this one. Let's see if this one works.
Okay. So. I was thinking about the cases where species depend on a minimal population of other species. So we can still think, can we use the critical point of another species in the equation to consider that the species population will grow?
So that's more or less what this means here. Okay, you have only a threshold for B. But actually, the threshold for minimum population of B has an effect on the population which consumes B, which can, if there are other resources. Okay, let's see now that there are other resources. Okay, so it's a generalist, and these ones don't have any Ali effect. Only B has an Ali effect. Maybe it's a situation that the predation may eliminate B, but A can be sustained by D and C. Then the A effect on B has no big difference, big effect on A. But if it's a specialist, if this does not exist, then A is bounded to the distance of B. And if it's so, if B goes extinct, A will also go extinct.
We can see this in some vegetable species, like there are founder species that invade grasslands and then they grow, and then other species are able to go there too. So
yeah,
think about plants that can happen as well.
Yeah, so there are situations where you can have population crashes, and you can have a beginning of an invasion, but the invasion seems successful, but actually it crashes later. So, okay, what were we discussing? Okay, to finish this, so here that's exactly the opposite situation at this one. This say we're interested in this one, okay? So this one has a lot of resources that can consume, okay? Which would be typically this is an herbivore, and these are plants or something, yeah. And these are the top predators, or the big guys, okay? And so if this here is not bound to any of, I mean, it is bound to all of them. So the population dynamic, strictly speaking, will depend on all the species, right? All the species. But maybe it can be a good approximation to consider if there's, for instance, if this guy doesn't have very strong preferences here, it can, if this one is not here, it can just consume this one. It can change easily, substitute one resource per the other, and say these guys here, okay, also prey on other things. They are not specialists. And they can exist there consuming other guys that I didn't draw here, okay? Or maybe they even go to this one also. So then this guy does not have a strong link with any other species. It has a lot of links, all of them are weak. And then one thing is that you could think, okay, effectively, we can write a model which is for the species, just for the single species, because the links are weak. There are lots of weak links of trophic relations, but none of them is very important. So then you can have effectively a single species model. Is that okay? That doesn't mean that I'm approximately. Yeah. Okay. So you could go on and write a model with 10 species, let's say. Okay. What? Just a minute. But this would be an ultimate model, okay, which is usually very different to parameterize because you have to have a lot of data about all the species. Okay. So now, say this here. Let's say this one disappears. So this will not affect strongly this one because there are others. Okay? And this one here disappears. This guy still will be consumed by lots of others. Right? So the presence of them for each individual species is not very important. Okay? You have to have predators, you have to have resources, but the dynamics of each of them has a small effect on this. And if this effect is small, either this from top down and bottom up, and both effects are in between each pair of species is kind of weak, then you can approximate the dynamics as this not depending on any of the species here. Therefore, it's a single species dynamics. Okay? Because the dependence on each of the species is not strong. Okay? Better? B and A? No, this is not single species, this is a two species dynamics. There are two species, and the models that we will see on Monday will have two species, not a single species. This is that's the situation where the single species dynamics does not work. You need two species. Therefore, you will have two equations instead of one. Okay? So multi-species dynamics would be, say, this is N1 and this is N2. We would have dN1 dt equal to something, and dN2 dt equal to something. Okay? And then this something is the subject of the next class. Okay? And they have to have, for instance, N2 has to have an effect on N1. Therefore, this one here will have a term of N2 here. Okay? And vice versa. Therefore, this will be called a system of differential equations, and more a system of coupled differential equations, because one equation will not be independent from the other. And this coupling will make the system a real two-species system, described by two differential equations. So this is different. So there were other questions? Oh, first you, and then you, and then you. Lots of questions.
What? I kept thinking, so my question kept growing a little. So that model, I'm going to call it the big model because there's a lot of factors in it. So we were discussing that it is okay for us to do some approximations because, well, I mean, it doesn't change at all. It doesn't change that much in the end.
Yeah.
But if I reduced it to just, let's say, one little ball before and then the one in the middle, I could, get a better precision from, like, a better connection from that one factor that I'm considering and the species. But I was just wondering, when is it interesting for us to accept this approximation, this little error that probably accumulates and gets a little bigger? When is it interesting for us to consider this error and prefer to get the error?
Okay, so depends a little bit on what is the question you want to answer with a model. Okay? So one thing that you can get out of this here is that if this can be described effectively as a logistic equation, let's say, okay, then it tends to be a stable population. Okay? So if you are just trying to explain why this population is stable, then this is it's okay already. You don't need the details. It's stable because it's a generalist and it's preyed upon by many other predators. And then you have a effective population dynamics, which is like a logistic, which goes to a fixed point, and then you stay there forever. And so you don't expect oscillations and so on. Now, on the other hand, maybe you have field work where you can actually count. So if you want only to describe why is this species kind of resilient here, okay, then that's enough as an argument. And now, say that you have you want to do field work, okay? So it's not well, if you are just field work without any experimental manipulation, if you can have the populations, all of these guys, and how they fluctuate and so on, then you can write a whole model. But that's usually not the case, because this is already something very simple as a trophic network. Trophic networks usually have thousands of species. Therefore, you have to cut somewhere. Okay? So sometimes you can cut with one species. Sometimes maybe you need to consider functional groups, or you have to say more or less depends on your knowledge of what is important for that system and the dynamics. And on the other hand, sometimes you have experimental plots where you can have a big region and then you have a long-term monitoring of species there. And then maybe you can have good data about the species because it's controlled. And then you can do better things than just writing down a single species dynamics. Okay? So it depends a lot. Is it just an observation, or is it something where you have actually monitoring of most of the important species? So it depends a little bit of what kind of situation you are trying to study with that. Okay? So you.
So regarding continuous time, when we studied the logistic equation, you showed us that we could model it by saying that the birth rate per capita and the death rate per capita were linear functions on the population.
Yeah.
Are there any other interesting functional forms for the death rate and the birth rate per capita for single species dynamics?
Yep. So I have not seen many things about single species dynamics going beyond this. Okay. Maybe. Well, there are some. Yeah, there are some models which I can't remember now exactly. There are some models that are connected to dynamics of cancer cells or something like that. It's not in ecology. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So there's something like that. But well, I would have to look. Maybe even in this book here. Here are some books for you to take a look. And here's a single species dynamics. So most of the time, single species dynamics is, yeah, no. So even here in the case of ecological dynamics, because the other one is cancer dynamics, there are no big other things, okay? But sure, I mean, it's possible in principle, and actually I mentioned that the birth rate as a function of n has to be something that goes this way, actually, not okay? So for maybe for large populations, you have to make a modification here, which would give you a kind of model with an exponential decay, but it's only important for very large populations. If you don't have a possibility to observe this, then why should we care? Okay.
Just a quick comment, but this is why we ecologists love redundant species in a system.
This is why?
We ecologists love redundant species in an ecosystem because you reduce the situation where one species, when goes extinct, the other goes together.
Yeah, something. Yeah, you have this kind of pressure of population. Yeah. So that there are more things than two species dynamics. That in the third week we will see what is called community moduli, which is three species dynamics, but not any three species dynamics. That's three species dynamics that are present usually inside networks. One of them is you have a resource and you have two consumers. Consumer 1 and consumer 2, for instance. So one of the results of competition theory and resource dynamics, which is the topic for next week, is that if there's only a single resource, then either one of them gets extinct. Yeah. But maybe there is one of them, say C1, which besides the resource here, can also consume this one. So when you have two consumers and one resource, you say these two consumers form a guild. And then you say that in this case you have intra-guild predation. Right? This kind of system, depending on the resource dynamics, can have the crash of all the population. I mean, except the resource. I mean, the resource will stay at a low level, but maybe all of them can get extinct. And this has been verified actually experimentally. So, more questions? You and then you. It's a competition between who raises first. Where's the mic? Okay. This one is the bad one, yes. Is it on? No, yeah. No, okay.
So I'm kind of confused about deterministic models. What I have understood is that we have to assume some values, which is deterministic, right?
Some what?
Values, like variables.
Variables?
But if we relate it to ecology, I don't think that it's possible that we can say that like the abundance, for example, of some species will not change in 2 or 3 days. So how can I say that abundance will be deterministic in a period of time?
I don't get exactly, but let me try to. So what deterministic models are models that show that are about, in our case, is about the change in time of the population level, of the population size. And the model is deterministic because once you give an initial condition, the future is already determined. Okay? Because we wrote down the equations and we solved the equations. Solve the equations means that if I give you the initial condition now, how's the system now, we can predict the future. So this is what you would call strictly deterministic. So there is no such thing in nature, actually, in nature, at least in ecological context, because the system is always under perturbations. Okay? But if the perturbations are not very strong, then you have a deterministic behavior immersed on fluctuations. So remember well the first class from Paulo about the logistic. Okay? So you can still say this population is well described by a logistic, but it will fluctuate around the solution and not be exactly on the solution. Okay? So there will be, if you go for data, the data will be like you have the logistic, and then you have a fit of the data, and then you have a kind of confidence interval for your data, for your result. And if the logistic is still in the confidence interval, then you say that the data is not exactly confirming the logistic, but it's compatible with the logistic, okay? Then you can have this kind of thing of like comparing models and seeing which is the best one, and maybe then you can rule out the null hypothesis and so on. So when you talk about deterministic models, you're talking about to grasp the essential dynamics of the system, and this will be important if your systems, which are always much more coupled than anything we can write here, if you are a good modeler, you will go for which are the important effects on this population, say predation, competition, mutualism, or whatever, or single species, and then you write down a model which gets you to the core of the dynamics. And then obviously there are other effects, but sometimes the other effects can be reduced just to noise, just to perturbation. Therefore, you have a deterministic dynamics under perturbations. Okay? And these perturbations, if the perturbations are very important, then your model is not okay because you are not taking into account some effect which is very important. So that's not a good model, right? So this is the point about deterministic models. They are the core of the understanding of the dynamics, right? But on field, everything is immersed in noise, and you do not have any very precise measurements usually in ecology, okay? So this takes you to the point that you will not have models like you have theories in physics where you can go and have a very precise measurement and say it's exactly this equation. You will have concepts that Paulo and the group are developing, which is that you have theories, you can have the certain dynamics, and this dynamics is compatible with your data. Your data but there could be others, and this is always this interplay between data and theory in ecology.
And if I would like to know about the abundance and the perturbations, like modeling the abundance and the perturbations of certain species, how many samples do I have to take?
You have to ask Paulo. No,
like
I mean, how much data I need, I don't know. We are not talking. We are talking about the core of the theoretical construct, which is the theory of ecology.
Mm-hmm.
So now relating this to data and how much data you need and so on is a completely different subject. Okay, so this is usually how much data is as much as possible, but sometimes this is not very easy to. So what are the minimum sizes of your samples and so on is part of what Paulo is trying to explain. Paulo, Andrea, and Ogro. So, which is a different subject, which is a subject of having good enough statistics to test models. Okay, so test hypotheses. So this is something else. Okay. So you. Yeah. I don't know. Okay, you. Sometimes I don't see.
I do not understand why the birth rate is falling as the population grows, because I would expect that in nature, as the population grows from a small size, you have a bigger density, so it's good for the birth rate.
It's the per capita growth rate. Remember that Gn dt was equal 1 over n is equal to b.
Yes, but I mean, I would expect that the birth rate will fall just after the population starts to compete.
No, look at this, okay? So that's the per capita, so that we don't, obviously the number of individuals that is born from a big population, right, is bigger than the number of individuals that are born from a small population, usually, okay? So, but the per capita rate is what we called for Malthus was constant, and now we see that this has been modified to see something which is this minus something which is linear in proportional to n. Okay, so minus. So what is the idea? The per capita growth rate. When you have when you have small population, you think, well, there's nutrients enough, so they will just keep. The birth rate is just the natural birth rate connected to physiology of the species, and the death rate is the natural death rate in that part of the ecosystem and so on, and that's a kind of paradise for them. Okay, so when the population increases, they have to compete for the resources, and the competition for the resources will, in the depletion of the resources, will induce a smaller birth rate because there are less nutrients, maybe because you need nutrients in order to reproduce. You have less nutrients, then you don't reproduce so well. And the death rate increases because some will be kind of starving. There are not enough nutrients for for everybody, and therefore, for large population, the death rate will increase. So it's the death rate, but it's the per capita, it's not the total number.
Yes, but in this graph, the competition starts with the very small population. And
no, this graph and in small population, this is birth rate. It's small populations have a larger birth rate than big populations.
Yeah, but I would expect that the competition will start when the size of the population reaches a certain number, not in the beginning.
Okay, I mean, you can do something like this.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would expect something like a bell sign.
Not a bell. No, it has to be for very small population. There's no competition, and then they have the birth rate, unless you have Ailey effect. We are not talking Ailey effect here. Okay? So then you could say competition does set in only after some time. Okay? Well, if you have enough data to study this, then you can do something like that. Okay? But this is if you want really to connect the data and for certain population with a certain level of resources and so on. Now, this here is what we are doing. We are building the simplest model where it decreases. Maybe it doesn't decrease very strongly. It can also be something softer, okay? Like that. So competition, small competition, even with small population, you should have a very small effect of the competition, okay? So this is a simple model which gives you, through the logistic equation, and this is what gives you a result about the pattern that you expect for a population that has intraspecific competition. This one should be only used if you have a specific population that, because at the end this will be also population going to the carrying capacity, at the end it's the same. So this pattern can be explained by a simple model and not by a complicated model. Unless now you are in a lab and you are really able to measure this birth curve. Well, then okay, when you have any reasons to get it experimentally like that, then you would write a model with an input of experiment, which is the birth rate. This would be okay. Yeah? But you see, one of the points of all the course actually is not to build models that can be strictly verified or which are predictive of the future. We are building models for other reasons. We are building a theory of population dynamics which can be applied to ecology, and this theory has features, and you use simple things which you know that it's more complicated in the field, but the simple things generate questions which are important. So let me just a little bit like think about of the importance of theory. So you could say I don't want theory. I mean no theory, not even mathematical or not anything. So what would be ecology? Ecology would be empiricism. Empiricism is just collecting data and maybe putting some categories, which is more or less what natural history used to be until the end of the 19th century. Okay? So you collect things and then say, okay, we have collections. Okay? Now, think again about the Malthus model. Right? So this is the first model that says that we expect a certain behavior of populations. If nothing blocks the increase of a population, it will grow exponentially. So that's an assertion. And then you say, okay, we have some instances where you see the exponential growth, but then somehow something happens. Therefore, an important thing is if you expect exponential growth and you don't see it, or it's just a phase, you need to explain why it is not exponential. So if you didn't have the exponential growth theory, there would be no reason to put the question why it's not exponential. You could say, why it's not polynomial? Oh, it's just polynomial. Okay. I'm okay with polynomial. Okay. So that is, you see, the difference between being empiricist and having a theoretical thing. We will see next week that one of fundamental results of competition theory is that given that two species have in common one single resource, only one species can survive, the other gets extinct. And then you go out and say, but there are so many species. Okay? So there's a famous paper by Hutchinson saying, why are there so many species? Okay? Because competition theory would tell you that you expect only a few species. There's something called the paradox of the plankton, which is not a paradox mathematically, but it's the name of the thing, that plankton's species, there are thousands of species in a book, anywhere, and they consume like 5 or 6, they are consuming only nitrogen, oxygen, they need light and so on, like not more than 10 resources, but why do you have thousands of these species, okay? So that's the point, okay? So the question, why are there so many species coexisting, is only a question due to the fact that you know that in certain you expect competitive elimination of one of them, okay? And you go in the lab, like Gauss experiments and so on, and actually you see competitive elimination of certain species. You have sometimes invading species, and they are better competitors for resources. The natural, the resident species goes away. But then you say, well, sometimes no. Sometimes I see lots of species, and they are feeding on the same resources. Why are they coexisting? So that's the driving question of 20th century, second half of 20th century ecology, which gave rise to the idea, which we will shortly discuss, of niches. Okay? So this is only exists because you have a theoretical framework. Without the theoretical framework, you are just collecting numbers. Therefore, what you need is a way. I'm not claiming that's the only theoretical framework you can have, okay? But it's a way to get a theoretical framework which will frame your questions that are important. If you expect something, you don't see it and you have to explain it. So if you are complete an empiricist, then you have no questions to pose. Okay? What would you do with your data if you have no hypothesis to test? Okay? Then it's just a statement. I have 10 individuals. Okay. Next one. So, and just to finish it. So, you see, Building theoretical frameworks is important, not only for ecology, but in particular for ecology. And now, you can have theory which is not expressed in math, but there's an advantage of math, because if you do express it in mathematical terms, if it's expressible in mathematical terms, then you get precise things. So it's different from verbal things, where you get sometimes confused with arguments and the rigor. You can be rigorous, but it's much more difficult to do it. Right? So having some mathematization of theories is something that will will enhance their precision. The consequences of the hypothesis are better connected to are rooted in something which is more precise. So you have this kind of thing, which shows you that when you build this theory, right, we are not talking so much about now I want to test this equation or this model, right? Because you build a theory and then most of the time you see the consequences of the theories in terms of pattern of coexistence, pattern of elimination, pattern of distributions, and so on and so on. Well, then you could say in some cases, I have good enough measurements in order to test more precise theories, models that are more precise. But this is not the only reason, and actually it's not the main reason to build theory and to do some math on the theory. That is main thing is that you need the theory to be as precise as possible, and the reasoning to be formally correct, and this is mathematics brings you that, and in order to build a framework where you can ask questions, then you can go on in the field. Okay.
Okay, I have like 4 questions.
So we have 10 minutes.
Okay.
Choose the most important.
Okay. Okay. Some are simple. So first one, would an apex predator? Would
Apex.
an apex predator be modeled by a single species model usually or not?
So this depends. Yeah, usually apex predators will be generalists, okay? And if so this will depend if there are essential, so let's say there are lots of preys, okay? If there's no big distinction between the preys, okay? Meaning that if I eliminate one of them, it will just prey more on the others, and so on. Then, and if this number of predators, and the number of prey, and each of them is more regulated bottom up from what they consume, right? Then you get the situation where the apex predator or top predator is not, say they are not, it's the only one, okay, the super top. Okay? Then maybe it can be a single species dynamics in the sense that there are resources, and the rest is on resources. Now sometimes you have nutrients or resources, which although you have a so obviously if it's a specialist, then obviously it's not single species dynamics. But if it's a generalist, will depend a little bit on actually on the fundamental niche, in the sense that maybe you have lots of prey, but some of them are essential in the sense that even if it can switch to the others, there's one of them that he needs, even if consuming the others. Right? He cannot live without. Then in this case, you get not anymore in single species dynamics.
Another question is probably a silly one, but is resource accounted for in the single species model? And like, if it is, what is the exact term? Or we just assume that there's enough resource?
Resources in the logistic model, for instance, are accounted in a way that's called phenomenological, because we are not modeling the resource. Okay? So the effect of the resources is just to create a carrying capacity. That's what the resources are. And that's all. So they are not modeled explicitly. Now, there's something called modern competition theory, which can have a relation with intra or inter-specific competition. And the modern, which is competition theory, is called resource dynamics, consumer resource dynamics, then when you have a situation like a consumer and the resource, you can model explicitly the resource. You can write down an equation for the dynamics of the resource, then it's explicit there, and how this dynamics affects the consumer. Okay? So then you can, for instance, in the most simple model, use a consumer resource dynamics and get out a logistic equation, but the carrying capacity now is given in terms of parameters of the resource, which is then explicit. It's not anymore, then it's mechanistic and it's not anymore phenomenological.
Okay. Oh, that's something we were discussing yesterday. Is a mate a resource or not?
No, usually not. I mean, it's not being consumed.
Yeah, that was what I was imagining, but I was like,
okay, it's
I
not.
put in here like resources.
I mean, you need you have the mating, but I mean, it's not a resource, because resource is in the word resource. Usually, you say it's something which is being consumed, right?
Okay, and then now goes the more complex question, I guess. When I asked about minimum patch size and minimum viable population, I was thinking of the forest, but also of like the first big extinction that we had on Earth was like when the atmosphere changed to have more oxygen, and then we had a species actually like augmenting its own viable habitat. And then, like, I don't know, I just, in my mind, those things are related, but I don't know if I'm just not understanding.
No, I mean, I think that there are distinctions that are not due to minimum viable populations. There are extinctions that, and we see a lot of extinction nowadays, because the environment changes and the fundamental niche of the species, which means what are the, for instance, for insects, there's a range of temperatures where they can actually reproduce and so on. If you have climate change, maybe the species would have to adapt, and some of them don't, and then they get extinct. Okay, so this is an extinction that has nothing to do with minimum population size, nor with patch size. It has to do with the fact that what's called the fundamental niche, we will discuss this. It means that there are ranges of temperature or ranges of environmental variables where the population can exist. And if this changes, maybe the population cannot survive.
Could you then explain very rapidly what exactly is a minimum patch size? Because
minimum patch size is a problem in spatial ecology, that if your habitat is finite, okay, and it's surrounded, say, by matrix, and sometimes your population cannot exist on a patch that is too small. So this, for some population, this is an effect that's important, and this is important in a sense. Some species which are not adapted to borders, and they cross the border, and then they get extinct because they cannot survive in the matrix. Okay, if the species are adapted to borders, then it just turns back at the border. Okay, so then in this case you don't have a minimum population size, but it's connected to usually the problem arises with habitat destruction. The species that are adapted to large habitats and so on, and then they are in a small habitat, and they don't avoid crossing borders of the habitat, and then they go, and then if the habitat is too small, the number of newborns is not enough to compete with the people, with the number of individuals that gets out of the border, okay, and cannot come back. So then there are situations where you have a minimum size of the environment of the habitat for a species to survive. Okay?
But here's what I'm not. Space is always means resource, right?
No.
I need
No.
space because I need to eat. Where is whatever is in that space, or I need a certain temperature that is available in that space and is not available elsewhere.
So
And then what I was imagining was like I have a species of, I don't know, monkeys who need to be in group to not be eaten by a predator. But then if the space available to those monkeys diminishes, then the very population diminishes, and then their capacity of surviving because of the group behavior will diminish.
So here in this example, you have a mix of both, okay? So in this example you are giving, you have an effect of group behavior, protective group behavior, and you have an actual ALE effect, which gives you a minimum viable population in order to survive. Now, if the habitat is decreased, then maybe the population decreases and goes through the threshold of the minimum viable population and goes extinct. But why I'm saying that there are species that have no ALE effect at all. They are not connected to an ALE effect. There's no predator and so on, and still they can go extinct in certain patches because they have the spatial movement takes them out of the patch, and the replenishment due to birth cannot overtake the number of individuals that get out. So then you get this population extinct. You can see in this project that I mentioned near Manaus, where you have patches of different sizes, and the populations, certain populations, do not exist. Do not exist in certain patches, the smallest patches, and the largest patches they do exist. There's a work, actually I have a model on that, it's about two species which I cannot remember the English name. It's Cutias and Cutiaras. And in the small habitats, then you have usually, I think, only one of them. In the larger ones, you have coexistence. Okay? And this is because they have different movement patterns, and one of them needs a larger area than the other. So the minimum patch size for one is not it's bigger than the minimum patch size for the other, and then you can compare this because you have controlled patches which are bigger and smaller. So I think we got to 10:30. So. Okay, nice discussions. Next week we start with multi-species dynamics, predator-prey dynamics, and competition, okay, which will be the next topic. It's a little bit more mathematical than this, but I hope we will get the good results. Okay, thank you.